their number one, this is around the world issue, their number one problem is their social media. It's having that kind of discipline to kind of go, turn off this so I can focus and concentrate on something.
Hello, and welcome to the Working From Home podcast with your host, me, Nelson Jordan. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Rachel Liu, who is the Service Design Principal at Pearson. Hi, Rachel.
Hey, Nelson. How are you doing?
Not too bad at all, thank you. Whereabouts are you today?
I'm currently based in London.
Oh, okay. Which part?
Oh, it depends on geography how deep to go, but towards southwest of London, towards Wimbledon way.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I like Wimbledon. I've been around like Wimbledon and Kingston and stuff. I used to live in London. Bit of an interesting story. I lived in Peckham for 6 months and Elephant and Castle in 6 months. I moved out from Peckham when my next door neighbour, who lived in the flat below me, turns out she was a drug dealer and killed somebody on my doorstep. And after that, wow. I decided to move out. Yeah. So I think that's a pretty good way to, I think that's a pretty good way to start a podcast. Just with really depressing, where do we go from here sort of news. But why not? Yeah, cool. I think that's probably killed the conversation. We should probably just leave it there and speak again another time. No. But anyway, thanks so much for joining us, Rachel. Really appreciate it. So what is it that you do as a service design principal? What does that actually mean?
So I guess at the heart of it is being really human-centered in problem solving to try and improve people's lives. And it's kind of then designing services to try and help that as a kind of part of a solution. I guess an example these days, you could say it's a very addictive one. I don't work on that space though. If you think of Netflix, for example, that is providing a service for you to consume content. And over the years, it's been so convenient. It's almost also become a service of that home cinema as well. And it's changed people's behaviors on how they consume and watch things. So we do that within the education space to look at how we can get people to learn and grow throughout different stages of their lives. So we design as young learners. I think actually at the moment there's demand from age of 3.
Okay. Cool.
All the way to adulthood. So and across different cultures. So that's something that kind of fascinates me because people have slightly different nuanced needs. And part of really being human-centered means you really trying to understand what do users really need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's a fantastic introduction. So is that kind of private or public sector or a mix of both?
So it could be either. If you look at the government space, there's a lot of kind of wave of service designers at the moment to try and make services much more accessible, much more inclusive. So there's been, like the NHS is quite a good example where they've really changed to make things easier to understand, because I think the average literacy is like, I'm not 100% sure, but it's around under the 15-year-old age. So, a lot of the jargon that we use and things. So that's the example of the kind of more public, but Pearson is a private within the education space.
So within that NHS example, then are you saying that the reading ages that they have to cater for with the literature, whatever that might be, whether that's brochures or leaflets or signs and things like that?
Exactly.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So there's different levels you can look at. So we look at different touch points across the service, like what is the journey that they're trying to go through to get something done. And for example, if you're booking a GP appointment, you could be going online. You could be having a phone call. That's 2 touch points. But what's the experience of that makes it easier, right? Are there certain translation issues? I don't know, like, certain things where English is maybe your second language.
Mm-hmm.
How might you communicate that? Maybe someone doesn't feel as intimidated if they do it online, as an example. But then the language that we use is super important, because that's how we guide the user to try and get whatever task they actually want to get done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so talk me through the average process then, and as simple as you can make it.
Average
kind
process.
of a layman for me. So say, for example, a company kind of approaches you with a particular problem. And maybe we'll think of an example, maybe not. But they come to you with a problem and they say, we need this solved. What typically happens from then?
So we go through something, a nice framework to think of it over the years has been not just trending, but people talk a lot about it, is the more of the design thinking kind of process. And it's in a design council, they have the double diamond. Now they've changed that and evolved that over the years to make sure that it's an iterative cycle, first of all. It's not just a linear process that you get through that process and tick box, but actually is something that is continuous and evolves over time. It's not, because change like needs change over time as well. It evolves. So in your example that you've just given that brief, a lot of the times that brief is we've made assumptions of what the solution is. So it usually might be it's a service or it's a digital website that does this, or a platform that will do this. So we then try to understand, well, how these are our assumptions. Have they been validated? Where's the evidence in that? Is that actually a real problem? And if not, like, what are the unknown and the known kind of spaces in that? So we do almost a bit of that kind of diagnosis to really understand the problem space before we jump into the solution, because sometimes the framing of the problem isn't what we really need to solve.
Sure. I totally get that. Sorry, I was just, everything you said there reminds me of like what I do, which is copywriting and digital marketing, in terms of you'll have somebody that will come with what they think is the problem, and then you actually look at it and either it's a problem with framing or that's not the problem at all. So like that deep dive and diagnosis is so much, it's got so much importance to it. I don't think people understand that the most important thing is that you're actually asking the right question in the first place.
Exactly. So we spend quite a bit of there. Glad there's the synergy of your process as well, actually, hearing that. And that's where we become more human-centered, like, well, what is the current state of the problems at the moment that are in this space as well? Are we actually talking, there's obviously certain like market kind of research and things like that and market trends, but what is it really that from a human level that they're struggling with, their frustrations, their pain points, and what is their journey? What is it that they're trying to really do, and how are they currently doing it? Because if we don't have a good picture of that, we can't really even come up with great ideas, right? Or the ideas will be very similar to competitors. So that kind of competitor analysis is quite limited. It doesn't give you fresh perspectives and new ways of thinking. So that's almost a way that we do that. We have those insights from real people. They could be for observation, shadowing, interviews, and so forth. It depends on what the problem is and who we can reach to kind of really understand it. And usually that helps then to frame the problem. It helps inform what that problem space is. And that's where the kind of brainstorming of kind of divergence of ideas kind of come about. That's what everyone's excited about anyway, because they're like, everyone wants to contribute to that ideation stage. Before then converging those ideas and prioritizing, like, well, what is it that we might want to prototype and try out first? Can we create like a concept of that, or what we believe will solve that pain point? and then actually test and validate it. And that's why I said that the cycle goes around, because even though you've got something at a high level, you want to get into the details, and hopefully each cycle you get more learnings and feedback that you get into that kind of granular part. And we're like, okay, that is what we want. And this process doesn't happen just within service design. It happens within like user experience and other places too. I guess for the differences with service design, it thinks about the end-to-end, much bigger holistic journey. So an example is like, maybe if you're more focused on the user experience, you might think of one touch point, like what I said with the GP example. It would be just that app to book an appointment. But we haven't thought about, well, what happens before, what happens after that? Is there something that gets confusing or, lost in that experience? So we're trying to tie and connect those dots and piece it into, well, what would we want the ideal experience to look and feel like?
So once you've got kind of an idea of a problem, do you ever have to think about like, what are the downstream effects of like the solution that you're implementing, or the upstream effects? Like the kind of example that I'm thinking about now, just because you use the NHS, which for our American listeners, if they don't know, is our National Health Service. You use the example of the NHS. Now I'm thinking of the policy, I think that came in a few years ago, about limiting GP time per patient to like 15 or 20 minutes. And where that might be good in terms of the number of patients that are able to be seen, that means that fewer patients, the doctor is able to spend less time with each patient, is more likely to miss things or misdiagnose things, or prescribe something or not even understand the solution in the first place. That impacts A&E, like waiting times and the number of people who are admitted and stuff like that. I'm wondering if you ever kind of are asked to consider the different parts of whatever cycle and problem that you're addressing.
Yeah, I think that's where the journey becomes a key role, because it's sometimes we have to zoom in and go, and this bit is where we want to make most impact. And maybe based on insights, this is the moment of truth that is super critical, that if we don't solve this, it has a knock-on effect on other areas too. And this is why I said having a holistic picture really helps, because sometimes we get into the detail too often and focus on that, say, that one app that just does this. Whereas we don't think about the context, which, people's lives are kind of, when they're in that A&E situation type thing, it's an emergency. There's the emotional need that's super important. And so we always think about the functional part of what needs to be done. But sometimes the missed opportunity is really to try and cater for that emotional needs side.
I guess that's how you take something from like a bog standard, okay, mediocre interaction into like a world-class interaction.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned there that I thought was really interesting is like identifying that point of highest leverage. So the point where whatever solution that comes in can have the biggest effect. And that sounds like you're presumably obviously like familiar with systems thinking.
Yeah.
And were you able to kind of give a brief description of what systems thinking is and its kind of relevance to what you do?
I'm not sure how to best describe it. But see, I came from a computer science background, so I think in terms of components and break things down, almost deconstruct things. I guess childhood example I can relate to is Lego.
Sure, yeah, we can all relate.
That's because, there's lots and lots of building blocks and things like that, and you put it together. And I think those are things that are modular and could be reused. And that's kind of, but also looking at a systematic problem is looking at like, well, who does it really impact? And sometimes we think of a particular like user, like the learner. Let's focus on the education space. But with COVID, for example, what's happened is like, well, actually there's a massive knock-on effect with teachers and the schools, but the parents as well. And then if you look at the parents of like juggling everything at the moment, and that's actually looking at it again, that broader perspective. So there's that level of like looking at it from within their, say, education system and challenging it from that perspective. But there's also kind of how we approach service design when we're thinking about delivering a certain thing. We want to break it down, deconstruct it into things that we can make things kind of modular and building blocks, or almost like kind of patterns that could be reused and because of best practices, and it has been researched and it has been validated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's super
I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was just thinking because my wife is a primary school teacher.
Right, okay.
And so that's had kind of a big impact on us. We were in Spain, in Valencia, for the first half of this year. And so she was, because obviously the Spanish lockdown was quite severe, she was teaching online, doing kind of a mixture of video calls and pre-recorded lessons, still on video as well. So yeah, I can definitely see how it's really, really complex. You have to approach things from like a multiple stakeholder perspective. You have to look at how it affects the teachers, what the problem is for the children, and how a solution will affect them, what will happen to the parents, what will happen to kind of this whole like infrastructure, I guess, and different stakeholders. Super interesting.
But I think COVID has definitely accelerated the whole, what does that even look like now with education, right? There's the whole big question, and everyone's trying to, I think at first it felt like everyone just needs to make like, survival mode. It just needs to work. Whatever works, because it was really unexpected, and we just have to do what we can.
In many cases, it wasn't even like what works. It was, let's get something in place.
We'll try whatever, just anything, right?
Exactly.
Just see
and kind
how
of that understanding that you're going to have to change. Like the first solution is never going to be perfect. You're getting into like this iterative cycle that you mentioned earlier, where you're just like, put something out there, get some feedback, improve that. Put the next thing out there, get some feedback and improve that. And I think it's so similar to how good businesses are run. Obviously you're just looking at a particular solution, but like good marketers, good product people, good CEOs are constantly getting that feedback from people. They're hearing what the customers have to say, and you do this in lots of different ways. You do it through surveys, you do it through feedback, you do it through kind of scouring social media and what customer reviews are saying and what your customer service people are hearing. So I think there's just so many similarities with what you're doing, and I guess there should be, right? Because at the end of the day, you're trying to create a solution, and that's literally all businesses do. Like they create solutions and in the form of kind of products or services or whatever that will take. So I think that's really, really interesting. You said kind of COVID was this accelerant, and this is something I've talked about with like previous guests, whether COVID is a catalyst for greater change. I've talked about it in the context of e-commerce, which companies like Shopify and like Amazon as well, obviously kings of e-commerce, they've seen like absolutely massive growth over COVID, and you'll have seen a dip in the brick and mortar retail sector to kind of, I guess, weigh that out. And then you've got it from the other side in terms of like working from home, and obviously the teaching online and stuff is a part of that as well. It's a type of working from home. And that seems to have been, again, something that was in the making and something that's been in the pipeline for a while. And then COVID has been this like rocket fuel that's just been like dumped all over it, and somebody's thrown like a match at it. And you've seen like years or even decades of forward motion, I suppose, been crammed into this 6-month period. It's really interesting, and I think sometimes it's proof that things can work, that there are ways of doing this remotely, and other times it's kind of highlighted that those solutions aren't in place yet. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, where do I start?
Pick a place and we'll go.
Well, I guess if I was to reflect my own journey, like, it's interesting because I guess part of the process involves a lot of collaboration. And suddenly with the COVID, it's like, how do we collaborate and build trust online, but collaborate in a way that we're so used to that kind of face-to-face humanness? Mm-hmm. We had a lab in London in the office where we've got the writable whiteboard space. We've got Lego around if we wanted to prototype stuff and things like that. And we loved having learners or with their parents over in the lab because we were doing research. And suddenly all of that just went. And for me, being a very people person, I'm like, oh, that's uncomfortable. Even for me, for someone who's building experiences that are digital. And I think that's what's interesting, that I kind of struggled through that. So I had to find ways because the screen time is actually an energy draining thing itself. It's not quite the same kind of face-to-face interaction. And to gauge and get that feedback that you mentioned, you're trying to build that rapport. And not everyone's enjoys video calls, know. No. And maybe they're really shy with the cameras, and there needs to be a certain way to kind of overcome that. And culturally, maybe they don't turn on their cameras.
Just to jump in there, because I think that's really interesting. I haven't experienced this too much myself, so I'm just going to put it out there and say it's like a thing that I've heard from different cultures. I think it might have been like James Schramko or somebody like that, who I think his wife might be from the Philippines, or if not, then she runs a company that pairs kind of Philippine VAs with Western companies. And I think he was giving advice a while ago and just said, just FYI, so you know, it's lots of them won't want to turn on their cameras. They're not doing anything fishy or anything like that. They just have kind of this, they just prefer not to, basically. And that's as a cultural thing. Whereas in particular, my American clients, they will always expect video to be on if we're having a call, every time. And the past, when I've had my camera not working, they've still asked me to turn it on, and I've had to explain. But yeah, cultural kind of expectations of those is really important. And then what you were saying about duplicating your in-person experiences and the inspiration that you're able to get, how have you been able to get around it, or have you been able to get around it and duplicate that kind of, I don't know, that sometimes when you get people in a room, there's just a bit of a spark. And you can't quite describe what it is, but you kind of bounce off each other in this, in the ideation process, if you said before, there's this co-creative atmosphere that you can just kind of feel. I haven't felt any tool so far that's digital that's put me in the same space. I don't know about you.
I think, first of all, just swapping one to digital doesn't work. An example of this in the education common thing, you take a book and you make it digital. Mm-hmm. That's not going to give you the same reading experience, right? So it needs to be designed differently because the interaction has changed, because the medium and the form has changed. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to almost leverage what is it that digital brings, and what is it that helps people unite to kind of spark curiosity or inspiration in a different way. And in some ways, it's invited us to be more experimental and playful. Now is the time to experiment. If you never had the courage, or you feel risk averse to experiment, it's almost you don't have a choice now.
Yeah.
In some ways. And maybe that mindset is a good thing, if you reframe it as that. And I've been kind of observing different ways that people have facilitated their kind of space. And actually it is possible, but it requires more planning, I think, than before. And it requires more tuning and really kind of figuring out what is it that makes it human across that and how we can replicate that part. So an example that we've been using, because we don't have those whiteboard spaces and we're quite visual, we've been using Miro and exploring that as our collaborative tool because it invites people in. But we
what
had
is that?
So Miro is like an interactive whiteboard spaces, but it gives you different whiteboards almost virtually to work on that space. So instead of like a Google Doc, is a whiteboard space equivalent that you can see everyone collaborating. And it's quite easy to access, it's very easy to use, which is super important because we also had to build that trust with stakeholders and they might not be using design tools like what we use. So we had to make sure it was accessible for them, they are comfortable with that. And if they're not, we have to provide different other options going, oh, well, we can create some slides for you of the output of that workshop, for example, and something, a format that they're familiar with and they can still contribute to. And that's why certain collaborative tools, it's how you use the tools, I think, you have to be a bit more imaginative about.
The bit that I just don't want to lose sight of at the moment, because I think you're going to go away from this a little bit. And I think it was brilliant what you said. So I just want to highlight it right now. It's not necessarily about duplicating an experience, taking something from offline to online. It's just about rethinking what it is you're trying to do in the first place and seeing if there's a way that digital actually gives you a benefit and it does something that the offline world doesn't do. So you want to play to the digital strengths rather than just taking, as you said, like a book and then just putting that book online. Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, what is the book trying to accomplish? The book, say, for example, if it's non-fiction, if it's a textbook or something like that, actually, like the words on the page aren't really the point of it. The point of it is to teach. So that you've got a scalable way of people accessing learning. Now, if you just think, okay, how do we get this digitally? You're kind of missing the point.
Yeah.
You're almost saying, sorry, definitely. You go.
No, that's what I've seen certain lecturers who have been resistant have the overhead projectors where they have their notes?
Yeah, I can remember those.
But they've tried to find a way to scan it, digitalize it, and just post that.
Yeah.
That's not going to have that kind of engagement and that especially for learners have to self-learn. So I think there's been a new skill for both learners and the teacher side as well. The technology one is obviously a key one, right? There are certain things of managing the technology within the virtual space, but also manage yourself, right? I think all of us have had to find ways of like, maybe we've had physical spaces and have boundaries is easier. What does that look like having online boundaries? It's quite distracting. There's much more noise if you think about it, because that's our only way for connection in the same time. But it's also where everything channels through that. So how do you, kind of almost have a balanced kind of still the well-being side? I think the mental well-being side is super important. I would say again, that emotional need is really needed, I guess, more than the functional. Because if you look after the emotional, you can then do your best work to kind of make sure that the functional need is met.
I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like that emotional side is completely missing from the digital space at the minute. I think if you compare it to the function, it's not even like 1 to the 99. I just don't think it is there. Do you think there's going to be some improvements in that sort of space? Is anybody addressing it?
I haven't completely seen everyone. Like, I've been trying to see, I guess I've been trying to find ways to look after my own kind of well-being as well. And there, I sense that more of the smaller companies or organizations are working on that more. I don't see as much in the corporate space. Pearson actually is quite good where they've stated that quite upfront, quite early on. And they have been putting resources and stuff. But I think that was almost like the first thing. But I think it's how do you make that continuous? And how do you even build that habit? Because it's a new thing. I don't think any of us expects kind of like these boundary settings. Some people have just gone much busier. I know that some of my friends have accelerated by, I don't know, like 100%. And they have no time whatsoever because they feel like suddenly they have to prove themselves more because it's online spaces, which is quite interesting. So everyone's in different phases.
What do you mean by prove themselves more?
Because I guess the threat of redundancy is much more and things like that. You feel that you need to prove your kind of your skill, your competency. So you feel like you obviously pressured almost to be busier, to try and do more. But actually, if you don't, again, look after the basics, your core, you're not going to be that productive, right? There's still this association with like hours versus like productivity and stuff sometimes. And obviously not everyone has that choice either, but I've kind of sensed certain people have gone much more quicker and it feels more amplified, even though they don't have kids, which is quite interesting to hear that. Like their priorities are even more shifted towards geared on work. And I don't know if it's because of other fears like potential redundancies and so forth.
So that seems like a bit of a breaking down of like the work-life balance. And you mentioned there that that might be because the physical barriers have broken down. There used to be this distinct cutoff when you'd get in your car or you'd pop on the tube, you'd leave your house, you get to work, and then work was where you did work. But suddenly work is everywhere. Like you're at home all day and you can just check an email, or you don't have that commute. So theoretically, that time has been freed up for like leisure activities, whatever that looks like for you. But I'm not sure most of that has gone to leisure activities. I feel like the people that I've talked to, a lot of that time where they would have been commuting has instead just been swallowed by more work.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. That's what I've sensed as well. I've had to be, I would say I remember my first couple of weeks, I was kind of like, I've kind of see those boundaries, and I definitely see the difference when I've been out for that walk before even starting work. So I've obviously had like really smaller strategies like blocking out those time blocks in the calendar and stuff. Even if it was me following it, at least I know that is my commitment in the morning. I even put my phone where I don't check it until at least 8 o'clock or something. And that's what I said, that the skill, actually, that self-management, we're not taught that in the context of, the physical spaces and those boundaries have been removed. We're all kind of still adjusting to it. But because those boundaries aren't there, we kind of then, over time, it hasn't become a habit. And then we kind of fall back at that, right? We kind of maybe do one complete week and go, yes, and then it kind of falls, and then we kind of not get back into it, sort of thing. But I found, for example, that I took up a habit where I hated running. I never liked running.
I mean, you sound a lot like my wife now. Despises it. She absolutely despises it.
I've never been a runner, but during lockdown, I was like, oh, the idea of being locked down, locked in, it was getting to me a lot. And I was just like, right, I'm going to start running. I'm going to do this Couch to 5K app that's there. I mean, after all, yeah, I'll treat myself as the couch potato, you know, even though I'm not, but I'm like, if they can do it, I can probably do it too. And I completed that. So over that kind of 9 weeks, and that has become a habit. And what's great about it, it was progressive. It wasn't trying to do everything, give your energy all in one go. Mm-hmm. It was building it up in increments. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of build that momentum. And then I'm like, wow, I went that far. Mm-hmm. And now I can actually say that I'm still doing it. So even though it's not every day, I'm doing it every other day. And that for me, that would never existed before. So I think we need to take the same example for self-management and those boundaries mm-hmm. and kind of apply it that same way. And that's where the kind of learning, motivation, all of that engagement comes into play, because I think of like how I learn best and how I can use that from understanding about the learning space of how to apply it to myself. So I'm learning in that process as well. Mm-hmm. Just because I've been in the education space, I've seen practices of people, what they've kind of done, and apply it to myself.
Sure. No, I'm so glad that you used that example, because just as you were saying it was occurring to me that that's a really interesting point, because it's an example of a digital technology giving you prompts to do on an offline kind of physical situation. And I'm wondering about if the role of technology in some part is to get you away from technology. And I don't want to get too meta about it, because I prefer concrete examples, but I'm thinking about the wellness perspective here, and we'll move on to learning in a minute, because I think that's fascinating as well. But from wellness, you've got like things like Couch to 5K that's very much exercise based, and it's a habit based. It's not a one-off thing. It's designed to get you doing something over a period of time and progressively get harder, but you also get fitter. So it kind of matches where you're at, which is fantastic. And then you've got things like Headspace for mindfulness and meditation, which I think is, again, an interesting but similar example in terms of its technology kind of getting you to switch off from technology. I mean, it's giving you a voice through technology. So it's this tool, but people are using it to switch off from the thing that they're getting from. So it's a bit of
I don't think that's uncommon, you know. I think that is becoming more the norm of, like, we've heard it from we were teaching kids design thinking, teenagers. I think it was towards the end of last year, beginning of this year. Their number one, this is around the world issue, their number one problem is their social media. It's having that kind of discipline to kind of go, turn off this so I can focus and concentrate on something. Mm-hmm. So it's again, and they use certain strategies. One uses like the Forest app.
What does that do?
So the Forest app is actually getting you to commit to like focusing on something. And then at the end of it, if you focus without any other distraction, you start growing a little tree. It's like like caring for a Tamagotchi or something.
I was just thinking of a Tamagotchi.
I mean, Tamagotchi is my childhood.
I killed my sisters, so yeah.
But I think for them, it resonates with them. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of interesting. We were like, oh, wow. So these are the problems that they are also having. It's not just with adults. It's actually quite broad in this digital age, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how each different generation deals with the social media that's in front of it, because because I grew up and had a certain part of my childhood before social media was even a thing. then I feel like we already learned those strategies, or we just didn't have that in place. But now, when social media has got more advanced, social media has actually, those companies have become better at pulling you in, because their whole business model revolves on it. It revolves around them consuming as much as your attention as they possibly can. Like that's how they make money. If you're not there, they can't serve you ads. And it's interesting that you talked about Netflix before. Obviously, the incentive is to keep you watching Stranger Things. But yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. In terms of like the education, then, so the number one challenge you think for the kids at the moment, that at least the ones that you're interacting with through Pearson, is that forget the learning, we can't even get them to concentrate for long enough for them to stand a chance?
I'm not sure, actually. We haven't actually, one of our barriers is that we at the moment can't reach young learners because of the schools, and we usually rely on partnership with schools. They've just been so hectic. And I've been more of was it a career advisor for one of the schools, just to have a career strategy program in place, and they just been so busy. We've never even barely met through that process. So trying to get close to younger people is really difficult at the moment. Sure. Whereas the only access we have had are the people who are maybe at university now, just about to be in university, still figuring out whether they want to go abroad elsewhere to work and to study. We can reach those people, so they're easier people to reach. But they still have similar things that what we've discussed as well, similar challenges.
Yeah, I think if I was in the situation, knowing what I'd know now, I don't think I would have gone to university like during this sort of period. And I said this to my wife, and she was like, yeah, but what else would you have done? It's not like you can go abroad, which is interesting. Like there's no gap year sort of stuff, is there? But yeah, from the other perspective, I guess that the students who have gone this year to university, I mean, we're just in the periods where it would have been like Freshers Week, right? Like last week or the week before, which is just like a week. I think even in our university, it might have been 2 weeks, where you're just out every night, socializing, drinking, in my case, and getting to know people. And they've just not had that at all, right?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I've talked to someone who is doing a master's, but actually went back to his home country because it then happened remotely. So he had that flexibility, which was like, oh, this is weird, but hey, it's kind of cool as well that you can be studying almost a master's in, US, but then be at home, in the other side of the world. But he did say the things that are missing is that student experience in terms of the people that you meet, that kind of actual living as a student experience. Now, if you take the course online and it's delivered online, okay, that is almost encouraging. Oh, if you're a full-time worker, it's pretty flexible. You can, go around that. And that's actually perfect at that stage of their life. But for someone who is just starting out of university, I question that. And he was saying the same. He was like, if I was studying a bachelor's at the moment, I'd be quite annoyed about it because you don't get that full experience. I think, but if I was now a master's, because, I've obviously met some of my friends and stuff, and I'm doing the second part of it, in his hometown, it's not as bad. But he still misses the kind of day-to-day, like you get to see people and it's different.
It's what
like the chilling out part.
Yeah, exactly. It's about all the other things that university includes. It's exactly what you said before about just taking a book and putting that book online. It's like, well, actually the whole point of university, or not necessarily the whole point, but not all of university is about learning stuff, you know. And I would actually say that for most people, the things that you learn from an academic point of view at university are probably the least important. A lot of what you learn at university are those like softer social skills. You learn how to live with other people from completely different backgrounds. You learn to have conversations with them. You learn probably for the first time for a lot of people, like how to become an independent learner. You know, you have a project to do or an essay to write. You have to learn how to go away on your own or in small groups and do the research, and then go through that period of writing and editing and working out what your ideas on a subject actually are, or in some cases, like myself, just regurgitating what other people have already, other studies have already said. But that's really, really important. Like university for a lot of people is the first time that happens. You can pretty much get, at least in this country, to kind of A level, and there's still some kind of spoon feeding going, you know, to some degree of this is what you're going to be learning in this subject today. For the next hour, we're going to be learning about whatever. And then you get that feedback, but somebody is your guide. And I think university is quite an interesting step for people because you learn some of the skills, how to do that. And actually, I would like to see, and I'm not sure if it's going on these days because I did my undergrad, 12 years ago or whatever it was.
I think similar
7 years
to me.
ago, and I did my master's like 8 years ago. So it's been a little while. But I would like to think that there's more focus being given to teaching people how to become learners, full stop, at university. Just as like, that's the most important thing. Like, I would want to teach my children someday. Like, I think that's one of the most important skills. Isn't necessarily like to teach them the actual knowledge, but to teach them the process of how to go about obtaining that knowledge. I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, it does make me wonder whether what is that position of higher ed versus other alternatives now? Like, are there other alternatives that are out there? What are apprenticeships like? Are even people doing apprenticeships now because of the COVID scenario and stuff? It makes me wonder, are there kind of, alternative ways to learn and be self-directed?
So I think it's about what you're actually trying to accomplish. Like, if by learning you're literally meaning picking up certain skills that you can use either in life or in the workplace, I would say yes, there are those alternatives. Whether or not they're particularly accessible to a range of people, I would say probably not. I still think like the best courses out there to learn things, to pick up actual like usable skills, the best online ones still cost a lot of money. A lot of like the courses that have been released over the last few years, the free accessible ones from fantastic universities, they still very much seem to be on offline courses that have then just been put online. And they see terrible engagement and completion. Like, and I've been there myself. I've started how many courses of, you know, through like the Stanford one, or what's the other one? I think there are loads of different like EduX and stuff in the US. There are loads of these. I've taken quite a few, or I should say started quite a few, and then bailed after a week or two because, quite frankly, they're courses that were designed to do in person, and then they've just been shoved online as kind of like an afterthought, and they've gone online learning. Good. All right. Okay, cool. It's learning and it's online, but it's not online learning.
Yeah.
But there's this other thing. I don't know if you've come across it or not. I'd just be interested to get your take on it.
Sure.
There's an essay. It's a really tough thing to describe without seeing it, but there's kind of a resource online to teach yourself like the basics of quantum computing.
Right.
It's I'm not particularly interested in that, I have to say, but I was interested in the method that they were using. It's like an online format combined of web pages and emails. And essentially you go through and you learn stuff, and it gives you quizzes as you go as part of this essay, but then uses like spaced repetition to then make sure that you actually learn that stuff over a period. And depending on your answers, it completely changes the frequency and the material that it shows you again, and what order, and the kind of progression that it allows you to make until it feels like you know the previous stuff. I wondered if you've come across that at all, or something similar.
I have come through spaced repetition because of being in the education space, but I've also come across it because my husband used, when he was learning Japanese, he finds it very helpful to put in almost your flashcards things into that. Can't remember that program on top of my head, but I think
for Spanish I used Anki.
Anki, yeah, that's the one. Yeah, so he does use that, and that's his way of reviewing stuff and making sure that he learns it. Interestingly, that would not work for me. Me and him have very different learning styles, I think, because then I think it's regurgitating it, or it's something that I feel like, oh, it's boring to kind of review the stuff. So I'm a learner. It has to be quite active, have to be sensing, experiential, doing something. So project-based for me works super well. And recently I signed up to this kind of sketching online art club thing, but it's to do with well-being at the same time. So there's creativity and well-being mixed together. And what's
the
really
name of
nice,
that?
It's part of the Surrey Art School. They've just launched it, and they've always been physical in a space that's quite close to nature. And they've had no choice, obviously, to pivot part of their business online. But what I've really liked about it, and I think it's kind of a model that I see maybe more common, is the mixture, like you said, the blend between the digital and the physical. So I received a kind of starter pack. There was also an email kind of video. So she had that video bite-sized kind of format where it's from her. So it feels very like engaging in a first impression. And she gets you to kind of collect things in nature. And the theme was like wisdom of the woods. And that's great. So you collect things in your own time, you bring it in, but you also had a starter pack of like a sketchbook. So it feels like, oh, I get something, I get to do it, sort of thing. And then she also added a sense of community. If people who want to, because some people get that encouragement from a community or accountability from that. And you upload your progress and stuff like that, quite, when you want to and things. And that feels much more connected and meaningful in some ways.
So she's obviously quite carefully considered the different aspects that she wants to bring in. Like she's got the digital there, she's got the offline, the experiential, the like hands-on stuff, and then she's got the community as well. I think that sounds like it's been done pretty well.
But she pivoted her business, not knowing, and she had to redesign this, and this is her second term. So I'm very impressed, because for her some of the content is quite new. So there's this whole like, does content have to be all polished and stuff, or could it be kind of swapped in and out, sort of thing? You do a more scrappier version because it's more that prototype, see if it works, see how many views you get, see how long people take, kind of spend on that. And I think she's got the kind of right level of like the amount of time it takes to digest the video before people get disengaged. But also there's an activity kind of worksheet that she has. And you can choose to be stretched if you wanted to. But then there's the core thing that you do. And then she's got a tutorial of prompts of how you might want to improve your technique. So I think it's really, it's a nice kind of combo packaged as an experience, right? Because then I'm excited going, I haven't even walked around or woods near my area in Surrey that I've never explored, but maybe I might want to go there by bike. So I think she's connected things that are both, it gives me a sense of well-being, exactly what she said she wanted to do. And it's interesting that she read up on the book about the mindfulness, that I've also done the course for that, actually. I can't remember the exact name, but I can find it for you if you need to.
Sure, we'll put that in the show notes.
But we have it where she used it as a framework of almost is the creativity and mindfulness together. So you're always finding ways to be mindful, but find a sense of novelty. And there's different activities, some which are more for a week goal. So it's a longer kind of thing. And some of them are quite small, but quite, feels that, I can do this. And I guess it's using maybe similar motivational type things as the Couch to 5K, but she's kind of translated slightly differently, but in a very mindful kind of way, which I really liked and appreciate during this time.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it's incorporated a lot of things like the community that we were talking about, but then the goal setting and the sense of accomplishment. I think it's about that, right? Not having one insurmountable goal that looks impossible to achieve. So how can that be broken up in ways that make you feel good for doing it, but also give you hope that you can carry on
definitely
doing that? But that's really interesting. But cool. I think that is a fantastic place to leave things on. We started talking about a murder on my doorstep in Peckham and ended with a lovely trip to the Surrey woods in a creative and mindset. So we've gone all over today. So Rachel, where can people find you if they're interested in learning more?
So I'm on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Twitter as well. I've also got this side little project that I'm doing about inclusive, shaping more inclusive cultures as well. So that's my little passion project.
Nice.
And that could be found as well on Instagram.
Cool. What's the name of that passion project?
Inclusive Pioneers.
Inclusive Pioneers, fantastic. And as well, for everybody listening, all of those links will be in the show notes. So if you're interested in hearing more about Rachel, then just pop over and see the transcripts and pick those up. Rachel, thank you so much. Been such a lovely conversation. And thank you for appearing.
Oh, likewise. Very nice way to end our Friday.
Exactly. Thanks again.
Okay, bye.
And that's it for today. You've been listening to the Working From Home podcast with me, Nelson Jordan. We've been talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly side of remote work. Thanks so much for listening, and I really hope you've enjoyed the time you've spent with us today. If you'd like to discuss the podcast, you want to make a new friend, or you're interested in working with me on a copywriting or digital marketing project, then visit nelson-jordan.com. That's nelson-jordan.com, where you can also sign up to my newsletter to hear about this podcast and other exciting projects. Until next week, goodbye.